Okay, guys, we're actually going to go into the fluid compartments that are found in our body for the EMT basics. Okay, we have three fluid spaces. We have intravascular, which is known as our circulatory system. Intravascular means inside our vasculature or inside our veins and arteries. We have intracellular. This is the fluid that's actually found inside our cells. And then we have interstitial. And interstitial fluid is kind of what we consider what we call third spacing of fluid, where it's not in our circulatory system, it's not in our cells, it's just kind of found throughout our body. Okay, water and some substances actually move freely throughout all three compartments. Okay, we do this by the process of osmosis. Osmosis is very similar to diffusion. Remember, diffusion is going from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration, and water basically kind of does the same thing. We have certain electrolytes in our body that we are trying to maintain at all times. We have salts, which is an extracellular fluid, so it's outside of our cells, basically in that interstitial space. We have salt throughout. We have potassium, right? Potassium is in our interstitial or intracellular fluids space. We have magnesium, we have chloride, we have calcium, we have all these electrolytes in our body, and they're all kind of helping to maintain fluid regulation. Other substances actually require carriers, right? Because of the substances that require carriers. If they require carriers, they also require energy in order for those carriers to be able to collect those substances to help facilitate the entrance of nutrients and waste in and out of our cells. This is probably one of the best pictures that actually kind of explains the fluid, the compartments of fluid within our body. So on the left there, you see the actual cell. That's that kind of beige colored object, okay? And then in the middle, we have all of our interstitial fluid. And remember, when we're talking about fluid, we're really talking about plasma. When we talk about water in our system, it really is plasma. It's not like water that you get out of tap water. That's actually very harmful to us. But we're talking about plasma itself. And then we have the actual capillaries, or the actual vasculature of the body. And this kind of shows how water just kind of moves freely in between all three of those spaces. How sodium will follow water, specifically with the electrolytes of sodium. You can see the Na plus there, which is the sodium, and then the actual kind of protein structure on the actual cell. That protein structure, or that cellular wall, is what kind of keeps sodium out, kind of regulates the need of sodium and potassium shifts without our cells. And we're not going to go too much into this at the basic level. You guys will definitely get a lot more of this when you guys go to intermediate and you guys start working with fluid replenishment, where you guys can start actually giving people fluid through an IV. But really, this is just a good picture for you guys to kind of see how that water kind of moves fluidly throughout the actual cells. Okay, I skipped ahead a couple slides. The slides that I skipped ahead for you guys was the slides on the intracellular space and the interstitial space. It's basically the exact same slide that I showed you on the last one. It's just kind of highlighting the different spaces for you so you guys can actually check those out for yourselves. And again, we don't spend too much time on that at the basic level because you guys aren't able to do, or at least at this point in time, you guys aren't able to do any kind of fluid replacements for our patients. In other words, you guys aren't allowed to start IVs. That is rapidly changing in our system. I think that all the EMTs before you guys, especially the intermediates and paramedics, are really trying to advocate, especially in our region, to be able to, for the basics, to be able to initiate IVs. I can really see that coming around the corner for you guys. That's pretty exciting. So shock defined, again, we are talking about inadequate tissue perfusion. Okay, guys, like I told you before, you're going to go out there, you're going to start doing some research. You guys are going to see thousands thousands of definitions of shock, and some of them are pretty damn sexy, right? Some of these are from people that have a lot more schooling than all of us combined, and they go on to write these dissertations about shock, and the definitions of shocks could be 20, 30, 100 pages long. I'm going to make it as easy as possible for you guys. You guys want it as one word? It's known as hypoperfusion. If you guys can't remember that, I'm going to give you 3 other words. Inadequate tissue perfusion. That's all it is, guys. Okay? We are going into an anaerobic metabolism. I am not able to get oxygen to my cells. I am not able to get that oxygen to cross the actual cellular membrane in order to diffuse with CO2 or any other kind of waste products that our cell is releasing. It is inadequate tissue perfusion. That's it. Okay? And again, if we can't get our cells in order to process that oxygen, in order to process the energy throughout our body, we are entering an anaerobic metabolism, and that is when we actually start seeing the first stages of shock. So when we're actually talking about the causes of shock, shock can basically be caused by anything, okay? But I want you guys kind of focusing on specifically these kind of causes here. Bleeding. Whether we're bleeding externally, that blood is actually leaving our body, and it's landing on the floor because we have been shot or we've been stabbed or we've sustained some kind of significant injury to where we might have lacerated one of our major organs, or we have lacerated a artery, or we have broken a long bone such as our femur or our pelvis. It could be internally. We might not even be able to see this bleeding at all, okay? It could be because of respiratory failure. It could be because of acute allergic reactions, or even some kind of overwhelming infection. It could be because of a massive heart attack. It could be because our diabetics are no longer able to produce insulin on their own, or the insulin that they do produce is not efficient enough for our body. Again, we'll talk about that when we get into endocrine. But they're not able to get those substances, those nutrients into the cells, such as glucose. They're not able to process that in order to help with the facilitation of actual perfusion itself. Okay? If we have any one of these causes, we are starting to have significant damage to all of our organs, and we can go into a multi-organ failure. And when we start kind of killing off our organs, when we start putting our organs into failure, it's not necessarily easy to get them out of failure. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Okay, so we have a pump problem, we have a fluid problem, or we have a pipe problem. Okay? So if we have a pump problem, some of the causes for that could be a heart attack. It could be traumatic injuries to the heart. It could be some kind of obstructive cause based on a whole other system, such as a pulmonary embolism, which we already covered in our respiratory show. We could develop a clot in our lungs that's going to kind of put a hinder on respiration or that adequate gas exchange at the alveoli level. And because of that, our heart's going to try to start pumping faster because it is trying to saturate every single red blood cell it can by pushing it through the lungs as fast as it can, by pushing the blood through the lungs as fast as it can, hoping that the lungs are sitting there and oxygenating the blood that it is. However, because we have a clot in the lung, that part of the lung is not being perfused itself. So it cannot be involved in the respiratory process, in the process of respiration, or another way to put it is in the actual process of gas exchange at the alveoli level. We can have low fluids, okay? Any trauma to any of the vessels or tissues, okay? If we are bleeding externally or internally, we are losing fluid from our cardiovascular space, and it's going into our third space, or it's ending up on the floor of wherever we've been suffered from this traumatic injury. We can get low fluid volumes from too much vomiting or too much diarrhea. Okay, we can dehydrate ourselves, right? Um, we need to make sure that we stay hydrated. We need to make sure that if we are vomiting and diarrhea, remember that we were talking about pH, our acid-base balance, right? I want you guys to remember which one of those is more deadly. Which one of those is technically more deadly to us, right? Remember that when we have a lot of diarrhea, we're losing base. Remember, base comes out the butt, right? We're losing base. So if we are losing base, okay, we are becoming more acidic, right? And remember that we can live in a state of acidity longer than we can live in a state of alkalosis or basic, okay? If we're vomiting, okay, we are losing acid. And not only are we losing acid, we're losing acid quick because your acid in your stomach is some of the strongest acid known on the face of the planet, okay? So if we're vomiting and we're vomiting for days and we can't control our vomiting, we are losing acid and we are becoming more basic. Because we are becoming more basic, we cannot live in that state as long as we could in an acidic state. So vomiting is technically more of a life threat than lots of diarrhea. Don't forget that, guys. Remember, this is all about metabolism and acid-base balance, okay? Or we could have a problem with our vessels. Our vessels may dilate, okay? There's nothing wrong with our pump. There's nothing wrong with the amount of fluid in our body. However, our vessels are too big in order to maintain an adequate pressure throughout our system, all right? Causes of poor vessel function is infection. We're going to talk about septic shock here. Widespread vasodilation, okay? It could be because of a drug overdose, specifically narcotic drugs. They can actually vasodilate somebody, and anytime somebody overdoses, and we do have a major problem specifically out in our region with heroin. Hell, it grows naturally an hour and a half away from our city, right? One of the biggest heroin crops on the face of the planet grows right up the street from us, okay? And as soon as they start overdosing, they are technically entering a stage of shock, okay? Any kind of spinal cord injury, we're going to talk about that specifically a little bit on this lecture, and anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction. We can have that widespread vasodilation. And really with anaphylaxis, we're also going to bring in pretty much all three of these when it comes down to it. When we suffer from anaphylaxis, we have that widespread vasodilation. We can actually start third spacing our fluid, so we can actually be losing fluid, and we can have our heart be working so hard in order to try to combat whatever the actual allergen is, to help our antibodies out to the antigen that we have been exposed to, that our heart can actually fail. It can actually stop working. Okay, so I did skip a slide, guys. The slide that I skipped is actually a table right out of your book. I believe it's table 12-1. That kind of breaks down a little bit more the actual different things that can cause shock based on if it's a pump problem, a fluid problem, or a pipe problem, okay? So make sure you guys look at that, and you guys will definitely look at that because I know every single one of you guys is going to read this chapter, right? Good. Okay, so cardiogenic shock. This is caused by inadequate function of the heart. We have done some kind of damage to the heart, whether it's medical or trauma. We have caused damage to the heart, and we could be going into a cardiogenic shock. Let me tell you guys something. Let me put it to you this way. When you guys run a code, when you guys run that patient who is pulseless and apneic, and you guys are starting CPR, okay, you guys are the ones that run this call. EMT basics are the ones that run this call, okay? I stand there as a medic with my clipboard, and I'm taking notes. I'm staring at the ECG to see if we kind of develop any kind of difference of rhythm on the monitor, and every now and then I hand you guys some drugs in order to give to the patient. Okay, but you guys are doing the work. You guys are starting the CPR. You guys are dropping the advanced airway for me. We are trying to maintain the actual functioning of the patient. And remember, when we are doing CPR, yeah, we are doing CPR in order to perfuse the brain. But why are we doing that? Really, when it comes down to it, we're trying to perfuse the brain in order to keep our kidneys functioning. We have to do such good CPR that not only are we covering the big three, our respiratory, our neuro, and our cardiac system, but we have to do such good CPR and make sure that we're switching compressors every 5 cycles, and make sure that we're breathing one breath every 5 to 6 seconds, and making sure that we're monitoring end tidal and oxygen saturation and the patient's heart rate itself, okay, in order to keep those kidneys functioning. If we can keep the kidneys perfused, right, when your patient goes unresponsive, when your patient basically dies, right, they are pulseless and they are apneic. They have no pulse and they are not breathing. We are entering the severest form of anaerobic metabolism. Okay, we need to provide that patient with oxygen. Most of the time, we're going to be doing it with BVM. We're working as the pump because we're doing CPR, and because we're doing CPR and providing oxygen, we're able to perfuse the brain. However, we are still developing all this crazy cascade of acidity throughout our body that even if we are able to get the patient back, even if we are able to get a heart rate back, if we have not perfused the kidneys well enough, your patient will not survive. The chances of survival are not good for your patient, okay? Because this patient has to be able to sustain themselves, and then the patient has to go through the natural process of getting rid of the acid themselves. And we know that the slowest and the most proficient way that the body is able to dispose of acid is through our renal system. We're going to have to urinate all of that stuff out eventually. So if we can keep the kidneys perfused, we're doing real good for our patient. However, when you guys are doing CPR, the second we feel a pulse and we actually have it and we're able to maintain a blood pressure, our patient is now instantly in cardiogenic shock. And this is where myself as a paramedic and all the other paramedics in this world, unfortunately, have to start earning our paycheck. This is where we jump in. This is where we take the call over from you guys in order to help sustain the patient. All right? But you guys are the lifesavers. You guys at the basic and intermediate level, you are the lifesavers. Okay? I just sit there and look pretty with my clipboard. I take some notes, right? I tell you guys kind of what to do. I kind of facilitate as much as possible, right? But as soon as you guys get a pulse back for me, it's now time for me to take over because this patient's in cardiogenic shock, and now I got to earn my paycheck, all right? But really, when we're talking about it, again, this is the inadequate function of the heart. Because the heart is not functioning appropriately, the heart can be actually not able to get all the fluid or blood back to the heart, right? So it can actually be settling in our body. We already kind of talked a little bit about right-sided congestive heart failure. Or that fluid could be backing up into the lungs, specifically if the left side of our heart has had damage. That left side of the heart's not going to be pumping efficiently. It's still going to be pumping blood out into the aorta, but it's not going to be able to bring in all that blood back from the actual lungs. So that's when we get that left-sided congestive heart failure, or we start getting those adventitious lung sounds because the actual fluid is backing up into our lungs. Okay? All right, so we have some kind of damage to our heart. Our heart has suffered a medical emergency, or our heart has suffered some kind of traumatic event. Because of this, we are backing up fluid into our vessels, right? Whether it be in our capillaries all the way down in our toes, or the actual fluid or the edema into our lungs, okay? The problem is that the presence of edema is usually abnormally large amounts of fluid between the cells and the body tissues, which actually start to cause swelling. This means that our fluid is not in our cardiovascular system anymore. We are starting to third space that fluid from our cardiovascular system into our interstitial space, okay? We're also, because we're not able to perfuse our cells are starting to denaturize. The protein structures of our cell walls are starting to break down. And now we also are having all this intercellular fluid all this intercellular fluid enter into our interstitial space as well. So we don't have fluid in our cells. We have all this nasty stuff coming out of our cells, specifically potassium. Okay. And we have all this fluid found in our interstitial space, and we're losing fluid from our cardiovascular system. Okay. Now, again, you guys remember that water naturally crosses all three of these barriers over and over and over again through the process of osmosis. The problem is that water not necessarily can contain all the nutrients or contain all the waste or contain all the electrolytes that we need in order for them to perfuse properly within our system. We really need to make sure that we are keeping the fluid in our system where it is supposed to go and let the body be able to naturally pull stuff out of cells when it needs it, or sucking fluids from our interstitial space into our cardiovascular system, or maintain our cardiovascular system in order for those nutrients and waste to be eliminated from our body. So again, we are in cardiogenic shock. We are screwed right now with Fick principle number 3. For whatever reason, we are not able to get the pump to function accordingly in order to process the circulation of all of our fluids. Because we are affecting Fick number 3, and because our heart has been damaged, we are now going to start also messing with Fick number 2, which is respiration, because that fluid is backing up into our lungs. We're not able to recruit as many alveoli as we possibly need through the process of respiration in order for good, adequate gas exchange. Okay, so because the heart is now damaged, our respiratory rate's going to go up. Our respiratory rate's going to go up because the brain tells it to, because our brain and all of those chemoreceptors we have in our head are seeing that for whatever reason, we're breathing normally. The brain realizes that, hey, I'm able to get the air in and out of my lungs. My ventilation is fine. Okay. However, something's going on with my circulatory system because I feel that the heart's not pumping correctly. Okay. So now because the heart's not pumping correctly, all this fluid's kind of backing up in my lungs. And because all this fluid's backing up in my lungs, your brain doesn't like it. So your brain says, hey, I'm going to speed up my lungs in order to try to get this fluid out, in order to force that heart to pump that fluid accordingly. Okay. And as you guys can see, right, no matter how we look at this, this is going to start a downward spiral. All right. This is going to start the process of inadequate tissue perfusion. All right. We are not going to be able to perfuse our organs in order to function correctly. And we're not going to be able to perfuse our cells in order to provide energy for those organs to function correctly. Okay, so again, cardiogenic shock, really the definition of it is when the heart cannot meet the demand of the body. Okay, we have a pump problem. It's going to not be beating effectively. Because of that, we are backing up fluids. Because of that, we are messing with respiration, we're messing with perfusion. Okay, we need a good functioning, adequate pump in order to keep us sustainable with life. Okay, so when we're talking about cardiogenic shock, this is a pump problem. This could be medical or trauma, and it's just going to keep continuing this downward spiral, right? Because the heart's not pumping, the demands of the body are just going to keep raising and raising and raising, which means our heart rate's going to keep going faster and faster and faster. And as soon as we run out of energy, because we're in an anaerobic metabolism, our cells are not meeting up with the demands of our body either. Our lungs are trying to breathe as fast as possible in order to get those red blood cells oxygenated. However, our pump's not working, and we're going to eventually run out of energy. And when we eventually run out of energy, we die. So here's a little picture just to kind of put it into perspective for you. We have enough fluid. We have our whole container is filled with fluid. Our pipes have enough pressure, right? Our pipes are filled with fluid. They're a good size. They're not too constricted. They're not too dilated. It's just the pump that is not working. Okay, some intrinsic factors, all right, could be myocardial damage. Remember, myocardial just means heart muscle. Myo means muscle. Myocardial damage. We've had a heart attack or some kind of traumatic event. We'll talk more about traumatic events when we get into the cardiac emergencies. It could be a dysrhythmia, right? For whatever reason, maybe we were born with it. Maybe it's due to a heart attack that now we're into a dysrhythmia. It could be just our electrolytes are off or out of whack, right? That sends us into a dysrhythmia. Or it could be any kind of valvular disruption. Remember that we do have valves in our heart. Our valves separate our atrias from our ventricles and the openings of the lungs and the body. Okay? Well, sometimes those valves can become, or sometimes those valves can malfunction. And because of that, those valves can be held open, and we can actually start kind of regurgitating blood in our system. And we'll talk about regurgitation of blood later on, specifically in cardiac emergencies. But either way, these are some intrinsic causes of cardiogenic shock. When we're talking about intrinsic, this is something that's basically inside. This is more of a medical problem. When we're talking about extrinsic, which I believe we're going to get to here in a little bit. Nope, doesn't look like it. Extrinsic causes would be I got stabbed in my heart. I hit my chest so hard during a car accident because I wasn't wearing my seatbelt, and I smashed my chest up against the steering column that I actually bruised the heart. That I took such a sustainable force where I actually bruised a portion of my musculature in my heart, which would act like a heart attack, right? Or, hey, maybe I possibly got shot and I had a bullet go right through my heart. Those would be all extrinsic causes.